Okay, we are picking up this morning in the 5th chapter of John, John chapter 5. By way of a little housekeeping, so as you may be aware, we only have 3 classes left in this quarter, especially because last Sunday we got shorted a little bit because of the storm. If we stay on track, that's going to put us through about John chapter 7 when we come to the end of this quarter. Now, as you may be aware, John chapter 7 is not the end of John. So we're not going to get all the way through that. However, where I leave off, Dan is going to pick up next quarter and then presumably make it through the rest of the book. Now, that being said, it's a good break point if there is going to be one, because John is divided up into not quite halves, but thematic halves. So that first half then is going to really deal with the majority of those signs, at least a good half of those signs and discourses that Jesus has, and his public interaction as he's moving throughout between Jerusalem and Galilee and going back and forth and interacting with people there. The last about 2/3 of John is all centered around Jesus' activity in Jerusalem, and the majority of it is spent in that last week. John places a heavy emphasis on the last week of Jesus' activity and his teaching. So it's actually kind of a good break point for us to transition into that period of Jesus' ministry. Now, what we're going to talk about this morning really sets up a lot of that activity in Jerusalem. Because what we've seen thus far, we've seen hints of it, but what we've seen thus far is people interacting with Jesus in a mostly positive way. We have in John chapter 1, Jesus interacting with John the Baptist and calling those first disciples, and they come to him and recognize who he is. They believe in him through faith. We get to John chapter 2, we have the miracle in Cana, the water being turned into wine. We have a positive interaction there. Jesus goes to Jerusalem, and even though there's the overturning of the money changers' tables, the people are reacting to him there as well. John chapter 3, we have Jesus interacting with Nicodemus. Here's a member of the Jewish leadership that is presumably having a positive reaction to Jesus. John chapter 4, the Samaritan woman at the well, and then the Samaritan experience as a whole is a positive interaction. Jesus interacts with that woman at the well. She in turn brings people from her town, and we see this very positive response. This morning, there will be a positive response from the individual that Jesus is going to interact with, but the repercussions of that particular interaction are going to start to change this narrative just a little bit. We're going to begin to see more and more glimpses of antagonism from Jewish leadership and from the Jews on the whole. So we'll get into that this morning, and then we'll continue to have some ups and downs as we make it through the next couple of chapters. But this story, in as much as successful ministry, is going to get bumpy. So that's where we're going to go, and that's where we'll be by way of housekeeping. So let's pick up this morning in John chapter 5. If you recall, the last thing we talked about in John 4, Jesus was up in Galilee and he healed the official's son, the royal official's son. So John chapter 5 picks up in verse 1. After this, a Jewish festival took place and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So Jesus now moving back down our map here. We'll just read through the first part of John 5 and then we'll go through it. John 5, can I have somebody read John chapter 5, verses 1 through 9? 1 through 9. Go ahead.
After these things, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up Now, there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porticos. In these lay a multitude of those who were sick, blind, lame, withered. Verse 5. And a certain man was there who had been 38 years in this sickness. When Jesus saw him lying there, and knew that he had already been a long time in that condition, he said to him, "Do you wish to get well?" And the sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Arise, take up your pallet and walk." Immediately the man became well, took up his pallet, and began to walk. Now it was the Sabbath on that day.
Yes, and it kind of breaks halfway through that sentence there, doesn't it? Okay. All right. So a few points of clarification to kind of get our bearings. Remember, John is, for the most part, a chronological book, but he is including events that are geared towards the theme of belief. And so he's not including everything. He's not including as much as Luke will or Matthew will or any of those things. So if we understand that we don't know what this festival is, it doesn't specifically say which of the Jewish festivals this is. If we understand this festival to be Passover, another Passover, then that would be nearly a year after the events of John chapter 4. So we've had some time pass. If that's the case, then the chronology has jumped ahead and bypassed many of the events that are found in the Synoptic Gospels. So John is not interested in including every single thing that's there, but those things that point specifically to what he wants us to see. And the purpose, I think, here, coming directly after that Samaritan response, is really to contrast that open reception of Jesus by the Samaritans with the disbelieving rejection by the Jewish leadership. And so we've got these two opposite ends of the spectrum. Now, remember, we were in Galilee last time, and now we're in Jerusalem. And yet it says in verse 1 that Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So just to clear up any confusion there, Jerusalem is on a mountain. So we're not talking directionally, we're talking elevation. So Jesus is going up to Jerusalem. And we have this place called Bethesda. Now, your translation may say Bethsaida or something to that effect. Unclear as to which one it really is. I'm going to use Bethesda for the purposes of our study, just to keep it from getting confused with Bethsaida of Galilee, which is where Peter and Andrew and Philip are from. But the word Bethesda means house of mercy. Beth, house, Esda means mercy. And then we have this specific location within Jerusalem, verse 2, the sheep gate. The sheep gate would be near the northern edge of Jerusalem in proximity to the temple complex. And it's called the sheep gate because sheep are brought through it for sacrifice. That's where they're bringing in the animals to be sacrificed. And so we have this pool then that is near the temple complex. Now, within these colonnades, next to this pool, it says, lay a multitude of the sick, and they're waiting for this movement of the water. Who has the NIV or the ESV? NIV, okay. Is there a gap there? Are you missing some verses? Does it say anything about the angel stirring the water and those types of things? Okay, so the NIV skips over that. I believe the ESV does as well, maybe some other translations. So these verses about the angel stirring the water, some believe that they were transcribed in later, that they were put in later, either as explanation about what's happening, or even potentially explanation about a superstition that existed about this pool. You know, obviously, if you have some natural springs, which from time to time will bubble up just due to the geothermal workings of the earth. And so there may have been a superstition about this particular pool that when somebody got in it, they felt better. They had a good hot bath, right? I don't know. That is not the point of this narrative, though, to quibble over that. So I'm not even really going to venture down that road. Regardless, it says that there's a multitude of the sick around this. Now, we could be talking, if we're using the word multitude, we could be talking anywhere between 50 and 500 people that are hanging around this pool. And if word has gotten around that it can cure illnesses of just about any type, what do you think that's going to do to people who are desperate? People who are looking for anything they can find to relieve some maladies. We see a few instances in the Gospels of people who said they had wasted all their money, all their resources on doctors. I think of the woman who had the issue of blood, remember? It said, I've given everything to doctors. I have nothing left. If I could only touch the hem of his robe, then I know I would be healed. And so it's that same type of mentality with this pool. So we've got a ton of people, desperate people, hanging around this pool. Now, consider, as you kind of picturing this in your mind, consider the human element of what's happening here. Okay, not only are these people desperate, but if some of these people are in the same type of situation as this man, these people are desperate, they're tired, they're destitute, they're dirty. It's very difficult, especially in the case of a man like this who can't move, who doesn't have a lot of mobility, to get somewhere to take a bath. And if this man can't get up and he's having to basically drag himself everywhere he's going, his legs and body are probably all scraped up. His legs are probably atrophied and many of his muscles. This is a scene of human desperation. Okay, now some of these may be worse off than others, but I've been to some countries before. I think of, for instance, when we went to Ethiopia. We were driving around Addis Ababa, the capital of the city, and you would drive by these places that had a lot of public interaction. So they were either churches that were long established, and some of them that had kind of a, I think you'll know what I mean by this, they have a touristy element to them, right? People can go in, visitors can go in and take pictures and things like that. So there's a lot of traffic going through these areas. And generally, if the city allows it, outside the gates of a place like that, you'll find people who are begging. And some of those people look really pitiful because the state that they're in. And when you see a lot of those people, it's hard to believe that they would be acting because some of their bodies are so shriveled and in such bad way that you know that their daily life is nothing like what you and I experience. That's most likely what's happening here. Okay, so you've got these people who are outside the temple, this house of mercy, and they're waiting. So we've set that scene now. Keep that in your mind. Now we read about this one individual then. One man was there who had been sick or afflicted for 38 years. And the details of the story tell us that this man was afflicted to the point of immobility. We don't actually know if this is paralysis. I gave a lesson on this a few weeks ago, and I kind of indicated that this man was paralyzed, but there could be any number of reasons that he's immobile at this point. If it's some sort of disease, some sort of polio or ALS or something like that, that has just decimated his musculature and made him unable to move, or if he's too weak to move because of this illness, there's any number of reasons that he can't actually get up and move himself around. So it may not necessarily be paralysis. Nonetheless, the conclusion of the narrative is the same. We have an individual here who can do nothing for himself. Now, we aren't provided any specific reason why Jesus chose this particular man either. If there's a multitude of people suffering from a variety of illnesses, Jesus just happens to pick this one guy. And as far as we can tell, this is the only guy at this place that he has any interaction with at this time. Now, it may be that Jesus chose this man because he was well known due to a long-term illness. 38 years being infirmed is a long time. Or it could be that Jesus is passing by as the stirring of the water is happening. And remember what the man is going to say here. I don't have anybody to bring me to the water when it's stirred up. Everybody passes by me. So it could be that the water at the time that Jesus is passing by is being stirred up and everybody has rushed to the pool and this man's just left behind by himself. And so Jesus comes up to him and starts talking to him. And the only thing he says to him, there's no hi, hello, there's no what's your name or anything. The very first thing he says to him there in verse 6, do you want to get well? Do you want to get well? Talk about cutting straight to the chase. Okay? So here's a man who has completely given up hope. And Jesus comes up to him and basically says, let me give you some hope. Do you want hope? Do you want to get well? Now, if you're this man and you've been sick for this long, presumably you don't know who Jesus is, because he's going to tell us in just a moment. The Jews are going to ask him, who was it that did this for you? And he can't even recall Jesus' name at this point, much less who he is. Here's this unknown guy that comes up to you. 38 years you've not been able to move. And he says, hey, you want to get well? What's going through your mind at this point? What's your mindset? What do you think?
It's obvious.
Yeah, I mean, well, yes, I want to get well, but I mean, there's nothing. There's no hope for this. So Jesus challenges then that hopelessness. So this is the explanation, verse 7. I don't have a man to put me into the pool when the water stirred up, but while I'm coming, someone goes down ahead of me. Jesus' next words to him, get up. Okay? I just told you I can't even move, but get up. So Jesus challenges that hopelessness immediately with his command by giving the man a task. If you ever want to get somebody out of a period of depression or self-doubt or something like that, I think one of the best things to do, one of the first things to do is give them a task to do. Because a task challenges the inability to move. All you do when you're depressed and when you've kind of lost all hope is you just want to lay and you do nothing. And you feel like, I just don't know what to do. I don't know where to go or anything. And so for somebody to come up and give you a task is a very key part of breaking out of that. Now, the task that Jesus gives him, though, is an impossible one. And note this, we know the result of this story. This man is healed. He does, in fact, get up. But what we don't see is this healing comes at this man's request, nor does it come because this man has had prior faith in Jesus. He has had no interaction, we believe, with Jesus to this point. And yet Jesus comes up to him and tells him, get up. But Jesus can sense that desire for healing, and he supplies that need. So here's another instance where Jesus knows something about the person before they know that he knows it. Okay, so you think about the Samaritan woman at the well. She had no interaction with Jesus. She didn't know who he was, other than the fact that he was a Jew, and yet he knows more about her than she thinks that he does. And so here's another individual. Now, I mean, his is obvious, though. Okay, so looking at how John phrases this then, it says, immediately the man was made well. Now, notice how many times throughout this narrative, a variation of that form is used, either healed or made well or something to that effect. I don't think the word healed completely expresses the full importance of what is happening in this narrative. It's not just that Jesus heals this man. So the word made, as in made well there, is that word genomai. It's the same word that's used in John 1 to talk about Jesus' interaction in creation. Anytime you see that word, something made that word is going to be used. And so just like the water to wine in John chapter 2, by Jesus' will, and in this case, his word, something is in one state and then it's immediately in another. That's the same thing that's happening in Genesis chapter 1 in creation. We have the world or existence in one state, and then God speaks and it is in another. It is immediately in another. And so that's the type of power then that Jesus is exerting on this man. The one that is healed is made so immediately, and it's done by Jesus' will. So whatever Jesus wants, he can do. And when they have this final detail then in verse 9, now that day was the Sabbath. And this is almost like if you're watching this in episodic form, this is like the black screen comes up at the end of the episode, part 1, and says, now that day was the Sabbath, and looking ominous because the next episode is going to be this interaction that Jesus has. So any thoughts on those first 9 verses? I know we've kind of expounded on those a lot, but I want us to get this picture. Eddie.
Yeah, Adam, one thing you asked me, why did Jesus pick this man out?
Mhm.
I think this transition kind of gives us an idea. He has a palate. And that palate is going to be very important in the next section.
Right.
Not necessarily everybody else there had a palate, but this man did.
Okay. So then he could have chosen this particular individual because it's going to create this controversy. So that's a very good thought. Yes. It's entirely possible. Anything else? Okay, well, let's get to that controversy then. So can somebody read verses 10 through 15, please?
So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "This is the Sabbath. The law prohibits you from picking up your mat." He replied, "The man who made me well told me to pick up your mat and walk." "Who is this man who told you to pick up your mat and walk?" they asked. But the man who was healed did not know who it was, because Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. After this, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Do not sin anymore, so that something worse doesn't happen to you." The man went and reported to the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. Therefore, the Jews began persecuting Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath.
Okay, that's good. Yeah. All right. Thank you. So think about, as you're seeing the reaction here, think about the absurdity of this situation, right? Here's a man that these Jews have surely seen over the past 38 years. Now, if they're kind of the upper echelon Jews, they may not be going into where all the poor and the sick and the lame are on a daily basis. But 38 years, surely they know about this guy, right? And so the Jews have surely seen this man lying outside the pool, yet their first statement to him is not to wonder at his renewed condition. It's to call him to account for a perceived indiscretion. It's absurd. Okay, so the question arises though, whose law forbids this activity? So they're going to get onto this guy and say, it's unlawful for you to pick up your bed mat on the Sabbath to take it from place to place. Can anybody give me the verse from the old law where it says anything about the mats being picked up or anything like that? No, because it doesn't exist. That's not what that prohibition is against. Now, we do get the account of the man picking up sticks on the Sabbath. And that is considered work in that instance in the Old Testament. And then that man suffers the repercussions of that decision. And then in places like Jeremiah, we'll also see other work being done on the Sabbath where God calls people to account for that. The Mishnah, the collection of rabbinical rulings and traditions, lists 39 things that a man can't do on the Sabbath. And it has secondary rules for all of those things. So if you're not familiar with the Mishnah, so you've got the Torah, which is the actual law of Moses. So those first 5 books. And then you've got the Mishnah, which is basically all the amendments that rabbinical teaching has put in there. They're not found anywhere in Scripture, but in order to do all of these things safely, whenever somebody comes to a priest or a rabbi and says, I've got this situation and I'm not sure whether or not it violates the law or any of those things. How do I need to handle that? Or can I do that thing? Or should I not do that thing? That's where the ruling was given by the rabbi. And then many of them are recorded in the Mishnah. So these are the traditions that Jesus talks about. And I want to be very clear before we kind of go negative on that. It is okay to have some tradition associated with how we worship. Let me be very generous with me as I say this, because we do have to figure out how we're supposed to worship. What is the right way to worship? How God wants us to worship. Many things are very clearly laid out for us, but some of those things, and we term them, right, necessary inferences. We have to infer what is meant by those things. So many of those rabbinical rulings are inferences based on this. Now, the problem with those inferences, though, in many of the cases, and in many of the cases where Jesus interacts with the Jews, is they had been bound onto the people to the point of they were Torah. And that was not the case. And so Jesus comes along, and that's where he can say, you have heard it was said, but I say. And so he clarifies many of those things. So I want us to be very clear. We could get onto the Jews for holding to all of those traditions and things like that, and really call them to account for that. But we have our own traditions. And so about worship. So they're not necessarily bad, but we need to be careful about how we place a hedge around the law and how we hold people to that particular hedge. Okay. Now, bear in mind, getting back to our account here, bear in mind the Jews are concerned with the breaking of law, but the man was told to pick up his bedroll by the one who gave that law. So we can't look at this story and be like, well, they're kind of right. He is sort of doing work. No, he's not. Jesus, the one who gave the law, who was present at the giving of this law with the Father, is the Word. He told this man, pick up your bedroll and walk. So he's answering to a higher authority, and he's doing what he was told to do. So this small transgression, when they come up to this man and they say it's not lawful for you to pick up your bedroll, the man gives the only answer he can. The one who made me well told me, pick up your bedroll and walk. He made me well when nobody else could. What else am I supposed to assume other than he's got the authority to tell me to do this? And so this small transgression, as we just stated, is potentially punishable by stoning. So he's got to give some kind of explanation. And the implication of his explanation is really, I think, similar to Nicodemus's explanation when he comes to Jesus and he originally starts talking to him. Remember, he says, we know that you've come from God because nobody can perform these signs that you do unless God were with him. So nobody's going to be able to heal this guy except somebody who's come from God. And so this guy can only assume, hey, I'm okay. I'm in the clear for this. So we then kind of have this antagonistic verse 12, who is this man who told you pick up your bedroll and walk? They're trying to figure out who this guy is. But the man who was cured did not know who it was because Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. And so, Jesus is not doing this in order to get his name out there. He's doing this with a specific purpose in mind. And I think Eddie kind of hinted at that just a second ago. Now, before we have that interaction, before they actually find out that it's Jesus, and I think they have a pretty good idea that it's him. But before we have that interaction with Jesus, Jesus comes back to the complex after these guys have left. And he talks to this guy again. Again, no preamble, No names exchanged, nothing. But Jesus walks up to him, he finds him, he says, see, you are well. Do not sin anymore so that something worse does not happen to you. Now, two things about this interaction. First of all, where was the man while he was ill? Where was he in terms of location in the city? He was at the pool. The pool is outside the temple. Where is he now? He is inside the temple. Now remember, the Old Testament had laws about who could actually go into the temple and serve in the temple. And there were designated places for each type of person based on background, physical condition, and those types of things. Even the Gentiles had a certain place that they had to go in the temple complex. But this man, whose body has been changed, has now also had a change of position. He has gone from outside the temple to now inside the temple. Don't miss these details. Okay, so the man's there, Jesus comes up to him, and the second thing then, see, you are well, do not sin anymore so that something worse doesn't happen to you. Now, this might seem like an odd interaction because the interaction with Jesus thus far has just been, I was sick, now I'm not sick. Jesus immediately goes to the spiritual aspect, the spiritual implications of what this is. So to this point in his life, the man's affliction was the worst thing that had ever happened to him. It ravaged his body, it ruined his life, it made it incapable of movement and sustaining himself. But Jesus, as he has done in many other places in John so far, and will again, uses the disease as a picture of something much worse in the man's life, which is sin. And so sin would have much worse consequences than physical deterioration if it wasn't dealt with. Jesus says, you've been cleansed in this way, now you've got some other things to take care of. Okay, so the man went and reported to the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. So now they know it's out there. Okay, so verse 16 and 17 then. Jeff already read 16, so let's do 16 and 17. Therefore, the Jews began persecuting Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus responded to them, my Father is still working and I am working also. Okay, now the synoptics record other instances where Jesus is confronted by the Pharisees for healing on the Sabbath. Mark 2 and 3, Luke 13 and 14, Jesus is confronted in those instances. And in Luke's account, Jesus reminds his critics that a man was allowed to rescue his neighbor's animal on the Sabbath, and rescuing a man would be of far more importance. So he could make that same claim here. Now, what Jesus says to them is the linchpin for the whole rest of this chapter. So if you got a pencil or pen or something, underline that phrase. My Father is still working and I am working also. We have this link between the Father and the Son. So Jesus' argument for healing, first of all, is that God's activity doesn't cease on the Sabbath. You go even all the way back to creation, days 1 through 6, God is active in creation, actively creating the world. And then on the seventh day, he rested. Now, we kind of have this idea in our minds sometimes that basically God took a nap, like God ceased from all his work. Was God still working even on day 7 of a sort? Yes, because he is providing for mankind and for this world. And so even on the Sabbath, God is still at work. He's still working. And so Jesus says, because my Father is working, I must work also. The laws of nature don't take a day off, and the law of love doesn't either. Hence the thing about rescuing a neighbor's animal and things like that. There are provisions in this. This is from Barclay's commentary. Jesus teaches that human need must always be helped, that there is no greater task than to relieve someone's pain and distress, and that the Christian's compassion must be like God's, unceasing. Other work may be laid aside, but never the work of compassion. The second commandment is like unto the first. So The chief important thing here is the link between Jesus' activity and the Father's activity. And as I said, this statement is really the main idea of the entire discourse to follow, which I have already lost much of my time on. Okay, but verse 18 though, verse 18, this answer is not satisfactory. This is why the Jews began trying all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Now, if we're reading this for the first time, this may be a whoa moment for us. We just escalated very quickly because there's been nothing thus far about the Jews trying to kill Jesus. Like they didn't like him and they wanted to talk to him or they wanted to argue with him, but there's been nothing about killing yet. And so John throws this in there. They began trying all the more to kill him because he was breaking the Sabbath and because he was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So in their eyes, he's flaunting the law, transgression of the law, and he's putting himself on an equal place with God, which is blasphemy, total blasphemy. So 19 through 23, Jesus replies, I assure you, the Son is not able to do anything on his own, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, the Son also does these things in the same way. For the Father loves the Son and shows him everything he's doing, and he will show him greater works than these so that you will be amazed. And just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so the Son also gives life to anyone he wants to. The Father, in fact, judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, so that all people will honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Anyone who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. As we're reading through this last part of John chapter 5, you'll notice if you have a red letter Bible, the rest of the chapter is all in red. This is all an answer to the charges that are being laid by the Jewish leadership. And so when we read these sections, see them as they connect to the prior story and to the situation that is developed. They're not a separate discourse. They're linked together. And so primarily here, just as he did in verse 17, Jesus links his activity with the Father's activity. Now, I know you can't see all these words. They're very small, but this is the text of the rest of the chapter. What I have highlighted here, the yellow words all deal with seeing. The green words all deal with hearing. And then the purple words all deal with testimony or testifying, so speaking, voicing. And that is how Jesus is going to lay out this argument. It's almost like a court case that he's going to state his position, he's going to give evidence for that position, and then he's going to call witnesses to back up that position in the last part of the chapter. So that's what's happening here. Yes.
You know, brother, what Jesus said in verse 14 is kind of prelude to all of that also.
Mm-hmm.
He's basically saying, here's the sign you have seen, and
Yep.
in your case, actually experienced the sign.
Yes.
What does that mean to you?
Yep.
Do you believe it? What are you going to do about it? It should lead to you changing your mind in whatever way you need to, so that spiritually, far worse doesn't happen to you.
Yep.
Something far worse, condemnation.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of a prelude, really. What are you going to do about the sign?
Mm-hmm.
Over and over again until you get to the very end.
Yep.
These things are written that you make.
Mm-hmm.
Make your choice.
Right. Yep. Maybe that should be a good subheading in your Bible under Gospel of John. What are you going to do about the sign? Eddie.
And Adam, I appreciate the way you are connecting this in at verse 17. You'll be this kind of linchpin. As I was reading through this, I thought how it connects with something almost at the very end of the gospel, when Philip in John 14 says to Jesus, show us the Father is enough for us. And Jesus said, Philip, have I been with you this long and you still don't recognize?
Yep.
He started it here, and he says it all through the rest of the gospel.
Sure, yeah.
If you see me,
You've seen the Father. Yep, that's right. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. That's at the end of John. And if you go back to the beginning of John, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so Jesus is conflated there. The 1:18, no one has ever seen God, the one and only Son, the one who is at the Father's side, he has revealed him. If you're seeing my activity, you're seeing the Father's activity. This is how he's working. Very good. Yes, very good. And so what are you going to do with that, as Dempsey said? Now, again, this section then plays out like a legal defense. Jesus' first statement there then is linked to that verse 17. I assure you, the Son is not able to do anything on his own, but only what he sees the Father doing. And so the implication there then is not only is the Son's activity the Father's activity, if any part of the Son's activity deviates from the Father's activity, it is immediately false. Now, this is your preview for next time because we're not going to be able to get through all this. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, Moses mentions to the people about this prophet that is coming. Do you remember the command that was associated with that prophet? What does Moses say that they're to do with that prophet? Listen to what he says. You must listen to him. That's right. Now, immediately following that is then what would be the sign of one who is a false prophet. If anybody says to you something is going to take place or something like that, and it doesn't happen, then you know that that person is a false prophet. If anything says anything contrary to the law, you know that that person is a false prophet. And I think when we read Deuteronomy 18, we read those statements separate from each other. Here's this one verse about Jesus coming, and Moses says, you need to listen to this person. But then you get this large chunk of text about what would a person who is not like this look like. And I don't think it's only talking about, I think he is talking about any prophet that says something that doesn't come to pass. But I think it's a specific modification to that prior statement. And that's what Jesus is saying here. If I have done anything or do anything or say anything that is not consistent with what the Father does, then I am not the Son. Jesus' point, though, in this discourse is going to be everything I do and say is consistent with the Father. I cannot do anything without his backing or without his command. And so that's the very first thing he says. I assure you, the Son is not able to do anything on his own, but only what he sees the Father doing. So throughout John's gospel, here our last statement, then we'll wrap up. Throughout John's gospel, Jesus continually states that his work is to do the will of his Father. And he makes 4 points here in this group of verses concerning his relationship with God and how he carries out God's will. First of all, we've already said this. He acts just as the Father acts, both in activity and in character. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father, not just what the Father does, but how the Father cares. Okay, the second thing, on the basis of love, on the basis of that care, the Father reveals all his works to the Son. There's nothing that God is holding back from the Son. And so the Son, like the Father then, with that knowledge and with that authority, has power over life and death. Now, I think this is a preview of what we're going to see in John chapter 11, Lazarus being raised from the dead. And we have other instances in the Gospels of people being raised from the dead. And so Jesus is linking himself not only to the prophets of the Old Testament who were able to do this same thing, but he's saying the power has not only been granted to me, I have the power because the Father has granted it to me. So the Son, like the Father, has the power over life and death, verse 21. And then the Son has been given authority to judge by the Father. We're going to leave it right there. That's your end of the Law and Order episode. Dun, dun, right? The Son has been given authority to judge by the Father. So what's going to happen with that? Remember, we said this is almost like a legal case. Jesus is not the lawyer in this instance. He is the judge. So what are you going to do with that? Okay, so we'll pick up there in verse 24 next week. Thank you all for your comments.